having to tell my kids, that was hard. Yeah, they were 2 and 5 at that time. And I remember the 5-year-old just saying, "Dad, what are we going to do? Yeah, how are we going to manage this?" Yeah.
Chee, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks, Georgia. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about your church. You have been at the same church since your family migrated here to Australia, and now you're the senior pastor. What did that church mean to you and your family when you first arrived?
So my family are non-Christians. So we migrated to Melbourne, and the reason why we connected with that church is because my mom's sister went there, and they're Christians when they were in uni. And so it was really, as a new migrant, the first point of connection, community, and that's why we really went. Yeah. Eventually, due to some conflict, basically my parents left, as well as my brother. So for some weird reason, I was still there, and I've still been there since.
Wow.
Yeah.
They've never come back.
They'd never come back. So my brother came to faith, but then he walked away. But then somehow I still stayed in the faith. I really came to Christ when I was in university. I think it was second year uni. It's a mind blank now. But I remember we went to camp and we woke up for morning prayer. But for some reason, it was like an encounter. Like that particular morning when I prayed, it was almost as if God was there and he was listening. I don't know how to describe it. It was just like an encounter thing where it's like, it wasn't moved from religion to a religious behavior to actually, no, God is there listening and he's hearing what I'm saying. And then all of a sudden we were singing this worship song, you came down from heaven to earth to show the way from the cross to the grave. Yeah. And through that, the gospel became clear. And it was like, oh, that's why Jesus died for me. And I took communion for the first time. And that's when I really gave my life to Christ.
So at uni, you were studying dentistry, I believe, and this is where you met your wife. Tell me about how you met.
Yeah, I met her in uni. We had mutual friends, and because she was a doctor, medical and dental kind of students kind of mix and have some similar subjects. And through mutual friends, I met her, and then we just connected, fell in love, and got married a few years later at 24. Yeah.
Now, 6 months into marriage, this is where things begin to get really rocky for you. You were diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. How did you find out? What was that process like?
So the way it happened was I had a lump on my neck, an enlarged lymph node. And so we had that biopsy, and then eventually they realized that actually that's a spread from the primary site, which is in the nasopharynx, which is the passageway between your nose and your throat. So they put a camera up my nose, took a biopsy through that, then they found out that that's the primary site for the cancer. So as a stock standard practice, they do a full body scan, a PET scan, what they call PET scan. And as we did that, they found that there was potentially a cancer in my right hip. I remember then I needed to get a bone biopsy, and then I waited 2 weeks actually through that. So prior to the outcome of that result, I remember they were saying it's an 85% survival rate, but then if it was cancerous at the hip, then it would drop down to 15% survival rate in 5 years. And so I remember it was a 2-week waiting period for the results. And
longest 2 weeks of your life.
Yes, it was. Anyway, lo and behold, I got the phone call and it was like, yes, it's cancerous. And I remember entering to the doctor's clinic, and they said, there's no cure for this. It's a 15% survival rate in 5 years. So they were going to treat me palliatively. So they weren't actually going to treat me at all.
Wow.
But because I was young, they thought, look, let's give it a go, give it a crack. Let's do some trial drugs and stuff like that. And we started treatment.
So what was the treatment like?
Horrible. It was meant to be 18 weeks of chemo. And then 7 weeks of head, neck, pelvis radiotherapy. It took a bit of time to adjust because you're just nauseated. It's just painful. It's just, you're weak, and it's horrible. And then they adjusted it. Then I got used to it. And then 9 weeks in, they did a test to see how responsive it was, and they found it wasn't responding. So that's when they decided to scrap the other 9 weeks and then decided to proceed with the 7 weeks radiotherapy. So then we did that. And then 2 weeks in, my late wife had a chip of her spinal disc, and it wedged against her nerves, so she couldn't walk properly. And so on her foot. Her foot wasn't working well, and then she needed back operation. So it's a bit of a sad story, and I can laugh about it now. But here I am going to Peter Mac to get my radiotherapy. Then I visit her Melbourne private hospital,
Oh,
where she
Chee.
just was recovering from her back operation. Long story short, I did the 7 weeks of head and pelvis radiotherapy, and then there was quite a bit of time of recovery. And that was hard because it's like, imagine you got an ulcer, but your whole throat's ulcerated.
Oh,
I lost 17 kilos. I lost my hair. I couldn't eat. I had to put a nasogastric tube up my nose. My wife was injecting me with painkillers, what they call it, ketamine, into my tummy and stuff like that. Because she was a GP and stuff like that. We were allowed to do that. And then, and eventually I recovered, and here I am. I'm actually one of the longest cancer survivors with my kind of cancer.
tell me. So they said that 15% survival rate past 5 years. There
Yeah.
is no cure for this thing, but you're standing here almost 20 years later, and you're essentially healed. How did that happen?
We had just decided, look, I'm just going to choose the medical path and trust God in it. And again, who knows what the outcome was. And that's a story in itself. Yeah, like God giving me a second lease of life and how I processed through that. But I must admit, it was really hard to believe after, because after we had fought the battle, then later we had to kind of work on our marriage again, because it's a two different journey, right? The carer and the one who's sick. And so we had to work through that. And then after that was going, actually, now I needed faith to believe that I'm actually going to be okay, because I'm like, well, how do I live my life? Like, because before that, you just, what's in front of you is just fighting the cancer. And then once you got over it, then it was like, actually, am I healed? Like, is the cancer going to come back? Medically speaking, it is. So do I even try to have a child? Do I not? Is that negligent? Should we just travel and make the most out of life? Do we kind of pursue and set up a household so that my late wife can be looked after? I had all these questions that I couldn't reconcile. And then I remember talking to my pastor about it, and he was mapping out options and timelines, but it still didn't bring rest to my soul. Until one day I was in my dental surgery in between patients, and then I decided to just grab my Bible and was reading through Joshua, and where it says, where with Joshua it says, "See, I've given you Jericho." And then for some reason, through that story, God spoke two things to me. One is that you got to fight with faith, but it comes from a position of victory, not loss. But the second thing is, it doesn't get given to you on a silver platter. It's like, see, I've given you Jericho, but you got to go take it. In that moment, there was this grace upon me that I was broken free from all those worries and struggles. And in that moment, I felt like even though everything was crumbling and in pain, my spiritual man in the inside was coming alive. I don't know how to describe it. And ever since then, I realized the greatest level of intimacy with God is spirit to spirit, and my mind submits to the Spirit. And through that began the journey of a foundational journey, the building blocks for how to cope through different things, how it impacts my leadership, how I make my decisions in life. It was very foundational, actually. Yeah.
Chee, let's talk about your late wife, Wei Lyn, who suddenly passed away in 2018. Can you share a little bit about what happened and the aftermath of that?
Yeah. So I was preaching she gets migraines quite a bit sometimes. And there was this particular weekend where she got a really bad migraine, and it was lasting for quite a few days. So I preached all day at church, came home, and the migraine was still there. And she's not one to complain. And so the fact that she's, saying it's pretty bad meant it was really bad. And so to which then I said, it was a Sunday night, I said, I think we need to go to the ED and have this checked out. So anyway, we drove at night, had the kids with the brother-in-law. And then we drove to Monash Hospital. And then surely enough, they triaged it as a migraine. But I think also because they knew she was a doctor, they decided, look, why don't we just put you in the waiting room and make sure it resolves first before we send you home. And it just so happened that there was an empty spot in the ED. And so they took us through into the room, and she changed her gown, and then boom, she just collapsed in front of me. And it was in that moment that I screamed, obviously. I was in absolute shock. And then they tried to secure her heartbeat again, her airway and all that. She stabilized her. And then they told me that there was an aneurysm, which is an extended blood vessel in the brain, and it popped, and she had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and she was bleeding, and then they needed to do the operation and all that kind of stuff. And then within one day, they declared her brain dead. Yeah, it was tragic. It was one of the worst days of my life.
And there was just no time to process and nothing you could have done. That's an incredibly hard thing to reconcile, I can imagine.
Yeah, it was. And then having to tell my kids, that was hard. Yeah, they were 2 and 5 at that time. And I remember the 5-year-old just saying, "Dad, what are we going to do? Yeah, how are we going to manage this?" Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's
Thank
okay.
you so much for sharing.
No, I'm very open. It's fine. Yeah.
I can imagine you were angry at God, all the things. Do you remember how your faith was kind of through that time?
When I was going through it, I was sad. I was grieving. There were times where I did lament. There were times where I'm like, God, why did this have to happen to me? Like, but I don't think I was bitter, angry at God. And so what happened was in ICU, so we had to wait for almost a few days because the brother was flying from Thailand to be able to see her, and she was an organ donor. And during that time, I remember I was reading the book of Job in bed with her. And then I opened up where it says, Job tore his robe in grief and worshipped him, which is amazing. It's one thing to read it, it's another thing to have that happen to you right next to you, and you go, that guy is incredible. And then it says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I depart. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. May the name of the Lord be praised always. I've preached on that, quoted it multiple times. But in this moment, it was the bit that said, the Lord gave me what I had. And in that moment, it was like the Spirit of God saying to me, Wei Lyn was not yours to keep. She was always God's to give. But in terms of how I coped, it was hard. My mom stayed with me, and my stepdad stayed with me for 6 months, which was amazing. They were amazing. I took 2 months off to recover. I just separated out in 3 ways: get the kids' rhythm, establish it well, make sure I've got my own oxygen mask on, and eat, sleep, exercise, hear from God. And then third, sort out all the affairs of estate planning and stuff like that. Then I went back senior pastoring as a single dad with 2 kids, which was nuts. And then, but through it all, God just, through the crying, through different things, God came at the right time, the right place, giving me exactly what I needed to be able to move on the next step. Yeah.
Chee, it's been 5 years, almost 5 years. And a lot has changed. You've remarried. Your kids are 5 years older. What does hope and happiness look like for you now?
The unique situation in my life was I had stage 4 cancer, and it's a miracle in itself to be healed. But God didn't heal my late wife. But I realized that it was a miracle for me to be able to grieve with hope. And it's equally as miraculous. And God intervening at those times to go, like I was reading, I think it was a proverb where it says, a sad heart, everything's like bad, but then a cheerful heart, you can feast on life. Life is a continual feast. And that's when it really spoke to me where, Chee, you got to start feasting on life again. It's not a circumstantial thing. It's actually a heart thing. And then bit by bit, he slowly started putting that, getting me through it to reimagine life all over again. Then I went through this transition from being a widower to a single again guy. And dating as a senior pastor is very uncomfortable.
I can imagine. Oh, I did not envy you at all.
Sorry. Then I started dating. And then through that, it's another story in itself. Then I met now my late wife, Eugenia, who's amazing. And by that time we had met, God had worked both in our hearts, where she was actually open to consider someone who was had kids, because I know some people aren't. And she never really wanted to marry a pastor, an Asian guy. And then here you go.
Tick, tick.
Yeah, tick, tick. Yeah. I remember my youngest son, I think he was maybe 3 or 4 at that time. People say they don't remember, but it affects their subconscious. Anyway, he drew a picture of his mum. There was this lady who wrote mum. And then he would be hugging it and at night. And there was this longing for a mum. And so now that I see Eugenia, we've been married almost 2 years now. Like, it's amazing. She's amazing. Like the way she's embraced them as her own, the way we fit. Because I realized, like, this is my way of saying it. It's like I realized as a single again person, I learned so much about marriage by not being married again, and remarrying. And I realized that it's actually hard to find someone that goes, "I want to marry you," because there's only so much of you that people can tolerate. It's like they'll be like, I can only handle 1 hour of you a month, maybe. But then for someone to go, not a whole lifetime, it's a miracle.
Amen.
So anyway, through that, where we are now, it's like I'm amazed at God, like the fact that, like the story of Ruth, like where we've got a family again. I can reimagine the future. My kids, I'm so proud of them. Have gone through this reasonably well, considering what they had to face, and having someone they call mum and they call Wei mummy. That's the distinction, and them embracing one another like this. It's amazing. And someone now you can kind of go, God, we're in a new phase now. We're going, how do you want to build this new family? And God, like, what's our role together into the future? And both postured to want to serve the kingdom.
Chee, it has been an absolute honor speaking to you on Finding Hope today. Thank you so much for sharing so generously, so openly. I know so many people are going to be touched and learn so much from your story. So really appreciate your time.
No, thank you for having me.